Ladies and gentlemen, let's make a start. We've got all of our technical issues are sorted, so thank you for your patience. And it's my great pleasure to invite you to enjoy tonight. And for those of you who are new to SOAS, to welcome you to SOAS. I used to be the dean here, and after I ran the place into the ground, they managed to begin rescuing it in a, let us say, reasonably stable way. So it's a very, very unusual institution. It regards itself as radical in many, many ways. Whether it actually is another question entirely. Those of you who study here will have your own opinions about that. But tonight, it's my very, very great pleasure to welcome the author of a startling book, Pedagogies of Collapse. And this is Dr. Ginie Servant-Miklos, who is at Erasmus College in Rotterdam, with a very, very star-studded history. She began at the University of Kent, where many of us also went. I was teaching at the University of Kent at one point in time. Steve did his PhD at the University of Kent. So it's like a reunion for us. And it's one of those interesting places which does encourage students and staff to take risks. So I'm going to claim some credit for the old alma mater, that you cut your eye teeth in terms of taking risks there, because what Ginie has done is to have taken risks. When you read this book, I think that you will appreciate not many people drawn from the academic ranks would write a book like this. It's a book about dissidence. Looking at it, I rather rephrased that term. I think it's a book about disobedience. To refuse the received order. Basically, to try to do something that is radical, that is unconventional, that is defiant, to try to build a more hopeful future, particularly in the face of climate change. But Ginie is involved in a lot more than that, so I want to put her work into some kind of context. Just a few days ago, she was in Zambia and Zimbabwe teaching karate. Now, you might think this is a very unusual combination, but in fact it works very, very well, because what we have in both Zambia and Zimbabwe are special outreach missions, if you like, projects, if you like, involving young women, and in a place like Zambia, for instance, in the worst slum in the entire country. It's one of these slums where the police go in and convoy once a month just to show they're not afraid to go in, and then they go out again immediately afterwards. Well, what happens to the young women, the girls growing up in such an environment? Someone's got to teach them, A, how to look after themselves. It's a violent environment. And someone's got to try to do something in terms of providing some semblance of opportunity for education. So what we do, and what Fair Fight does in these places, India, Zambia, Zimbabwe, is to provide a cocktail of provision for self-defense. So women are not mistreated physically and sexually. Provide all kinds of instruments so they can lead, as it were, a more satisfactory life. Something as simple as providing sanitary products. Period poverty is a big thing in many of these slum and poorer areas. And providing slowly but surely some sense of possibility of getting education. All of this forms, as it were, part of a tapestry. We're fighting for educational reform, we're fighting for pedagogical reform, we're fighting for environmental salvation. At the same time, we're trying to fight to improve the lives of people who aren't going to wait for the promised land. They've got to get on and get something done in their lives now, despite all of the disadvantages that they face. So 2015, I think, Ginie started this organization called Fair Fight. You know, gonna fight, make it a fair fight, give the girls a chance. And it's been a huge, huge success. So we've been very, very supportive of that. Many black belts have accompanied her and her colleagues on these missions to these places. Female black belts, so that there are role models, and international male champions, and their role is a very, very simple one. You'll appreciate this. Their job is to beat up on the local male teachers, as in seriously beat up on them, and say, look, if we, X number of international championships underneath our belts, take this seriously, we bloody well should as well. And that kind of thing has worked, a very strange combination of factors. So I wanted to start by asking Ginie, how does she make this very strange combination of factors in her life and her mission, in her outreach? How does she make all of that work?
With some difficulty. I'm very confusing to people, to a lot of people. I'm very confusing as an academic because I have no home discipline. I studied what was called PPE, Politics, Philosophy and Economics at the University of Kent. At the same time, I did a double degree with Sciences Politiques in France. And at the same time, I did my master's degree in human rights at the Kent Law School. And then, after a failed career in human rights, I got a PhD in psychology from Erasmus University. And then proceeded to teach political economy for 7 years. And you find all these disciplines enmeshed in the book. And most of that comes from the fact that I follow my own pedagogical prescriptions in terms of self-directed learning and lifelong learning, and I never cease to read, and I never cease to engage very profoundly with what I read to the point where I'm comfortable enough to discuss it and teach it. And for me, integrity is a very important value, so I can't live a split life. For me, all of it has been an integrated experience. So I came from this development, international relations, human rights world. My early career was in NGOs, so I worked in the Caribbean for the Red Cross. I worked in Togo for a Christian charity. I worked in Vietnam for a Vietnamese charity, which was my last human rights mission that went quite wrong, including a hostage-taking situation in the Mekong Delta, which we won't go into now. But the karate for me was a part of how I processed the physical stress that I was under in these very delicate situations. I had severe post-traumatic stress disorder coming back from Vietnam, as you can imagine, from the hostage-taking situation, and karate helped me to process that stress. And it was at a moment of great personal difficulty in 2012 when I was in the middle of I was living in Southeast Asia, in Singapore, in the middle of a very stressful life moment, and someone asked me, what is it that you would really like to do with your life? And I said, you know what? Martial arts has given me so much just like survival value in terms of how I've been able to process my stress, reconnect with my body. I think other women could really benefit from this. And that's how my passion and my background in international development came together with the karate aspect, and the idea for Fair Fight was born. It is only later then, when I was working as a progressive pedagogue, it's in 2018 I started my work with climate and environment, where I realized, hey, you know what else we can process? Eco-anxiety. That's something we can process with martial arts as well. And that's when I started integrating my martial arts work with environmental pedagogies.
Well, I can absolutely understand some of the things that you were saying. I monitored a little civil war in Thailand once, right up to the Mekong Delta. I would not like to be kidnapped in that particular environment or held hostage. So I absolutely understand how difficult it must have been. But you went away and processed all of this, and you became, as it were, a pedagogue of a certain order, self-directive order. This is quite a new concept for many people. Here at a university, it's meant to be something like a God professor, although my students don't take that very, very seriously, obviously. But what does it mean to be a self-directed, self-taught, self-experimental, I guess, pedagogue?
Yes, so it is a fundamental belief about the nature of human curiosity and human learning. So it's a belief that fundamentally left to their own devices, humans are driven by a curiosity drive. we all, if you watch young children, we all have a drive to learn. And school, so one thing I did while writing Pedagogies of Collapse was research the history of schools. And in fact, the public school system started in the UK. And its purpose was not to create self-actualizing individuals, it was to tame child drunkenness. So, because children had been pulled from the countryside and thrown into factories and coal mines, and child alcohol abuse was a serious problem during the early industrial revolution. And what happened is, with the release of massive amounts of fossil fuels into the industrial system, children were no longer as efficient a means of production as machines. So the more the machines took over, the more our industrial overlords, not through benevolence, but through pragmatism, realized surely there's something better we can do with these drunk children, and so produced a factory-like system of schooling with bells, whistles, quartermasters, and the concept of time was invented in schools. So schools with clocks were brought into the countryside to teach the peasants about time and keeping time. And so all this system was designed to breed obedience, so that these children would be silent, obedient workers to then go. Once the machines were doing the basic tasks, you needed people to watch the machines. And so that's how the school system became more complex throughout the 19th century. But self-directed learning was not the point at that time. So to believe that that schooling and education is not a tool to breed market-ready workers, but rather a means to actualize our full human potential, is already a radical position to take. Of course, I come from a long lineage of progressive thinkers, from John Dewey to Paulo Freire to bell hooks. But what I have done, the unique contribution I make to self-directed pedagogies, is I realized that the way self-directed pedagogies are done today is very elitist. So it's self-directed learning for the rich and mass education for the poor. In a college like where I used to teach, at the Liberal Arts College in the Netherlands, it was double, the tuition fees were double the national average, and we had self-directed learning across the board. But in order to succeed in self-directed learning, you had to have enough prior knowledge, enough what you call metacognitive skills, to be able to manage that on your own. The kids that I work with from Rotterdam South, who are mostly from migrant backgrounds, mostly working class, and that I teach in the context of the Bildung Climate School, cannot manage self-directed learning without first being accompanied and told it is okay. You will make mistakes, and we're not going to punish you for it. You can go and investigate. Of course, every human has this capacity to tap into that curiosity drive. But what we see is within the working classes, which in the Netherlands are all funneled into vocational education, they're all told they're too stupid to work with their brains and should therefore be happy to get a position as our handy workers in the system from the age of 11, by the way. So they're tested at the age of 11 and then sent to vocational schools from which there's almost no coming back. So it's those people that I've now directed my methods at, progressively accompanying them to the point where they can feel fully human again.
I mean, is there a precondition for this? I mean, when Paulo Freire wrote his great book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, I mean, one of the preconditions for people being able to be self-directed was to recognize they were oppressed. So how do you talk to your young colleagues and students about the nature of their oppression?
It is different depending on where I teach. There are multiple contexts in which I teach, ranging from the master's program that I teach. I teach in the Masters in Societal Transitions, which is a context of upper middle class, students from wealthier backgrounds, all the way to the girls in Zimbabwe, through the mainstream psychology programs at Erasmus and the Bildung Climate School. The Bildung Climate School, for context, is an education project that I'm working on that manifests all the pedagogies I wrote about into an actual concrete project. It is the first credited program in the Netherlands that combines vocational, applied, what you guys used to call polytechnics, and university students all together doing the same program. In the Netherlands, this is not even legal. So we had to skirt around all kinds of things to be able to allocate credits for that. And so if I'm working with university students, the point is not to make them aware of their oppression, but make them aware of how they contribute to the problem. If I'm working with girls in Zimbabwe, then we have a different conversation, but I can't throw complicated words at them. And that's my chief beef with the left as it exists today in academic spaces. What I wrote in Pedagogies of Collapse is, if I need a PhD to understand how you're talking to me about my oppression, then you're not talking to me about my oppression. You're talking to me to make yourself feel good about how erudite you are. So when I taught the vocational students, the students who were in the trade schools, in the Build and Climate School, that was really for me a wake-up call. Come on, Ginie, this is what you've been preaching, so talk in a way that they'll understand. And I managed it, and it's not that I had to dumb down what I was saying. I realized the way that we talk about this in academia sounds dumb to people who are not in academia. They're like, who do you think you are with all these, infinite qualifiers after capitalism? This doesn't resonate with their experience. And what Paulo Freire and John Dewey said is, you cannot teach if you cannot connect with people's daily experience. So that's where I just start. What is your experience? How do we take that? And for me, because I live in the Netherlands, that means I need to teach in Dutch sometimes. And because Dutch is like my third language, I struggle with words, and that's great, because so do they.
Okay, I mean, a lot of this, therefore, that you've put into your book, comes out of direct experience. Some of it, you had to labor for it, as you said. You search for words in your third language from time to time. How did you, A, get the idea for writing this book, and B, how did you begin translating your thinking and your actual teaching into a form of words that made a book?
I was going through a bit of a burnout with the academic system. It was around the time of COVID, and I could see the world was burning around us. And I was fighting off some journal editor about some insignificant dispute over epistemology in some journal articles that I realized no one would ever read. And I was like, what am I doing with my life? The world's on fire, and here I am arguing about epistemology with some person in America who's asking me whether the participants in my qualitative study in working class Danish men self-identified as men. And I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? These are working class men. I cannot possibly ask them what gender they identify with, because that's now not how working class people talk. And if you had any idea, if you ever got out of your ivory tower, you would know this. And I got so fed up that I said, I'm leaving academia. And at that moment, I remember going to my mentor, Lisbeth Norgath Elens, was getting promoted to full professor, and I went to her inauguration. And there I met re-met, because we'd been working together for a decade, my current professor, Simia Denktas, and she said to me, Ginie, don't leave academia. I have a new option for you. We're piloting a new scheme. It's called the Impact Career Track. You don't have to do the H-index publishing thing. You can actually go and write whatever you want. I said, really? I'll take up that challenge. And so I picked up a pen, and I just said, I don't even care about academic conventions. I'm just going to write the sum total of my 15 years of living. So this book is not an academic book. It's about my life. It's autobiographic. It's philosophical. It's about
a very learned book all the same.
Yeah, I mean, my life is very much enmeshed with, I read like crazy, and I tried to understand events in my life, my own existential crisis, my reckoning with Trump's election, it's kind of what Mills called the sociological imagination. I kind of realized how much my life was enmeshed with global forces, and I tried to make sense of that through Simone de Beauvoir's existentialism, through political economic concepts, I work a lot with Gabor Mate's work on trauma. So I read my own alienation in Singapore. I mean, I remember being there in Singapore, surrounded by crazy rich people. You've seen Crazy Rich Asians, like those kinds of people, and they were so lost in life. The alcoholism among the rich is almost as bad as among the poor. And I just thought there must be an explanation for this, and I said, yes, I think it's a trauma reflex. It's a flight from oneself, from one's traumatic childhood. And then I looked at the counterpoint, social justice movements, and that was a lot harder for me, because I had been involved with racial justice movements, with gender empowerment movements, with environmental justice movements, and something didn't sit right with me in the way that they were so ineffective at actually creating progress. Sitting on the A12, which is the main motorway to The Hague, that they can do all day long. But actually negotiating within a political context to get meaningful legislation and progress, actually winning elections for a change, that they didn't seem so good at. And not only were they not good at it, they weren't interested in actually doing the work of progress. And I realized they're not really in it because they want to move the material conditions of the oppressed forward. A lot of these people who are involved, for instance, in Extinction Rebellion, were white middle-class people going through an existential crisis. And what they were looking for was a cause to give their life existential meaning. It's a fight reflex from trauma, especially people who were locked up for 2 years in COVID, young people who kind of lost their life's meaning, 2 years locked up behind screens, looking for somebody, anybody's cause. And what I saw is a direct shift from protesting for climate to protesting for Palestine. The same people from one to the next completely abandoned the climate cause. So for instance, in my university, we had a group called Occupy. I joined them, I was on the barricades with them to protest for the university to cut their ties with Shell, our big Dutch national fossil fuel company, who was secretly financing the curriculum of the business school to have them say favorable things about the oil industry. And I supported that. And then me and a group of staff from the university put in place a whole process to really get the board to change their behavior towards sustainability in the university. And then Geert Wilders wins the Dutch parliamentary elections. We get a far-right government. They say we're going to cut all the science. And then our university board just goes, okay, then no more sustainability. We're cutting everything. All sustainability programs gone. Not a peep from these students because they were protesting about Palestine. And they were writing things like, long live revolution, we want revolution. And I was like, you and whose army? Because I said, you guys, you have revolutionary ideation. You know who's got revolutionary intent? The guys who stormed the Capitol on the 6th of January. They've got guns. They're training. They actually want an actual revolution. The far-right militias in Germany that are taking over entire towns, they have revolutionary intent. You guys are just living out your existential crisis, borrowing somebody else's cause. And the question, I know this drives people on the left crazy when I say this, but I'm like, what have you actually achieved? Yeah, that's not the point. This is a place, somebody said to me from Extinction Rebellion literally a few days ago, that's not the point. It makes me feel like I belong. It's like a post-capitalist space where I realize that other things in capitalism are possible. I'm like, you can join XR because you are wealthy, upper middle class who doesn't need to work for a living, because when you get arrested by the police, you're not going to get beaten up and you're not going to lose your job. And so you literally exist in that space because of capitalism. So don't give me the anti-capitalist thing. This is not how this works. I'm not immensely popular among that kind of side of the left for some reason.
Well, I wonder why. But I mean, this does pose certain interesting questions, almost of an existential as well as of a political nature.
Very much.
I mean, where do you position yourself? I don't just mean in terms of your political affiliations. Where do you position yourself in relationship with other people who may, in their own perhaps misguided way, be trying to do something, even if it's the fashion of the moment? How do you relate to people that you've got to work with if you're going to achieve some kind of recognizable change in the world?
Yeah, so I just spoke with Bloomsbury to get the green line on my new book, which is called The Left We Need, Sex, Drugs, Rock and Roll and Climate Justice for All. I work with a concept which I called in the book imperfect solidarities. It is the recognition that sometimes you want to throw people off a bridge, but you still have to commit to working with them because they're all we've got. I live this personally in my work with Zimbabwe, Zambia, and India, especially working with some of these male martial artists you mentioned. It is not easy, especially as a woman coming in there. And for me, especially as like a queer woman, it was not easy being a queer woman navigating very Catholic spaces in Zimbabwe. It's always an imperfect act of just cobbling things together and making it work. And that is the kind of imperfection that I ask us all to embrace. I do not refuse dialogue, I refuse fundamentalisms. So somebody comes to me and says, I disagree with you on this or that, okay, let's talk about it. For the Bildung Climate School, we are working with people from the far right to the left scale of the spectrum, and I don't have a problem with that. I'm like, are we able to talk? Okay, then let's talk. Okay, you're a far right politician, but let's talk seriously, because most of the people who live in your constituency live 7 meters below sea level. And you know this, and you know what's coming for them. So what I'm asking for you is, how do we create a life for these people when the water comes? And when you talk like that, instead of talking in isms, instead of talking in like, either you agree with me or you're a fascist, which I hear a lot on the left. I have some colleagues who are respected left-wing intellectuals in my university who literally call everyone a fascist. Everybody from the green left to the actual fascist party is a fascist. So if everyone is a fascist, then it doesn't matter who you vote for, right? Because it's all the same. And I strongly disagree with that. It makes a difference whether the green left is in power or Geert Wilders. It makes a difference whether it's Donald Trump or Kamala Harris. And I think we are paying the price of our own ineffectiveness. And what I want from the left is a capacity to break out of this moral performance, to break out of this, what Piketty called this intellectual elitism. Piketty picked up very well on the fact that the left had lost the working classes. What I always tell people is, if you don't have the working classes, you'll never win. And so all my work is about reconnecting. So for instance, in the Bildung Climate School, we have the working class students from the trade school and the university students. After week 1, the working class students come to me and are like, I think I'm gonna quit. And I'm like, why are you gonna quit? They're like, because these university students, they make me feel dumb. And I'm, you know what? Everybody gather around, circle, just tell them what you just told me. And her credit, this girl from the trade school says, yeah, you guys make me feel dumb, because the minute I try and say something, you're already flying out there with some theories about economics or I don't know what. I can't follow, and you know it. The university students, whoa, I'm part of the problem. Yeah, what are you going to do about that? So sometimes I'm confrontational with people.
Well, what did they do about it?
They changed their way of working. They realized they were part of the problem, and in the end we had some very successful, so they were forced to work in Frerian projects where they had to have at least one student from the trade school, one student from the polytechnic, and one student from the university. So the way you engineer the pedagogical space can create these opportunities for dialogues. But you know, I am not, I don't believe in safe spaces so much as what some of my colleagues call brave spaces. So I'm not here to shield your feelings. I'm here to tell you a few hard truths, and then we can either work with that or not. But I never mince my words in my classes.
Okay. Tell us a bit about what happens after this book, Pedagogies of Collapse. Sex, drugs, rock and roll, that kind of thing. I mean, I grew up in the late 60s, the era of revolution and experimentation. There are 2 years I remember only as a nighttime haze, and other parts of those years very, very much in police cells. How does that kind of basic dissipation as well as commitment unite to form a functioning and effective individual in trying to change the world?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's the title is of course tongue-in-cheek. I realized that if conservatives or anyone who wanted to criticize me, the first thing they do is, as they do, look you up, and then realize that I do a lot of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and use that as a stick with which to beat me. I was like, I'm going to beat you to it. I've got the stick, come get it from me, I dare you. And so, but it's a bit tongue-in-cheek because basically I'm very Simone de Beauvoirian in my approach to human relationships. I find it shocking that the last acceptable form of ownership is man over wife or wife over man, that we still think monogamy is a good idea, like enforced monogamy is a good idea in times of collapse. I experienced this personally when I had complete breakdown, that having at least 2 people there to like share the burden of helping out and being there for me and supporting me, that's That's like non-monogamy at its best. Of course, it can go catastrophically wrong, but I'm calling basically for an end to the bourgeois values, what Simone de Beauvoir called the bourgeois value of the nuclear family. And so recreating different kinds of relationships as ways to navigate collapse. And the drugs part, so I was part of like a research project on psychedelics. And I owe my own sanity and my recovery from PTSD to psychedelics. So I did MDMA therapy to overcome my first bout of PTSD, and I live with a chronic illness, fibromyalgia, which nothing was working for until I discovered psilocybin. But it's also a cautionary tale because I have overdosed on drugs, so I know the good, the bad, and the ugly of drugs. And there's the opiate crisis, and there's alcoholism, the amount of alcoholism I saw in Zambia and Zimbabwe, the meth use in Zimbabwe. And this is really a plea to people. We cannot drug ourselves into a coma in order to not deal with collapse. So it's really a warning of like, please, we have got to do better than drink ourselves silly because we can't cope with the hardship of collapse. And psychedelics can be a wonderful tool to help you accept your finitude and to like work through traumatic processes, but it can also be an escape to not deal. And so it's really a cautionary tale about the good, the bad, the ugly. And the rock and roll part is more about the Bildung. So it's more about the art, music, culture, the things that are still worth living for in times of collapse and that don't cost a lot of carbon.
Okay. At this stage, ladies and gentlemen, I've hogged the floor for far too long. I think that we should open it up for any questions, discussion, or interventions that the floor might want to make. So does anyone here have a comment or a question they want to put to Ginie? Hutan.
That's quite inspirational in many ways, Ginie. You talk about oppression, and the oppression comes in different forms. And from a pedagogy point of view, there's also epistemology of ignorance. There is ignorance, there's also misinformation, and that can be quite powerful. And I saw during COVID there was a lot of anti-vaxxing kind of mentality coming through, and that was brought in under the umbrella of there is science behind this, there is kind of knowledge behind this, but it was actually expanding misinformation. How do we stop that as a route to collapse?
It's going to be very difficult. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Zach Stein. So Zach Stein is a friend of mine, and he's now specializing in existential risk, in particular the risk that AI poses. It definitely, when I speak with Zach, I have trouble sleeping the night after. We came to the conclusion that definitely our governments will starve people before they starve the robots. And the robots are the ones are largely responsible for producing misinformation as part of global tech warfare on one another. It is extremely difficult to resist misinformation because of the way the brain works, because of confirmation bias, because in times of insecurity, in times of great uncertainty, then fear, the amygdala literally lights up and is looking for pattern recognition. I'm also worried that people who take drugs and psychedelics are prone to falling into these crazy cult-like conspiracy ways of dealing. How we deal with that, it's difficult, but I do think that education, and particularly experiential pedagogies, where people have to, with good guidance of properly scientifically trained people, do the research themselves, as it were. You know what my students said in the Bildung Climate School? The number one thing that mattered to them, they trusted their teachers. It is through the trust of teachers and through us, the scientists, taking responsibility for saying, yeah, actually, you know what, we don't have a neutral role here. We're here, Latour said this, you cannot be neutral anymore if you're in science. You have to say, if we don't do this, we're all gonna die. And so I take that role very seriously as a scientist, to be that person of trust, and in trusting me, to be able to bring people back from these misinformation loops, and never do it in a way that says you're wrong or you're stupid or whatever, but like accompany them to say, so this is what's happened to your brain, this is why you are like literally accompanying them along the scientific journey of this is why it's okay that you believe this, because this was literally engineered for you to do this. Here's how we can do this together, and really not make it a I'm clever, you're dumb, because that is the worst possible thing you can do. That is the most alienating thing you can do for people. So it's really about rebuilding trust, connecting with people, reaching out to people where they are. What I see, for instance, in the working class communities that I work with is huge distrust in scientists. Why? Because the scientists come from the university, which is in the north side of the city, cross the river to get their data in the south, and then fuck off and bring nothing back to the communities. Of course they don't trust them. Who are these white people who come here with their check boxes and to do experiments, and then they're going to publish something? This is why I stopped publishing in academic journals, because I want to write stuff that people from Rotterdam South, that the Moroccan mother in Rotterdam South that barely speaks Dutch can understand. I want to be able to have those conversations to build that trust again. We have to take responsibility for the trust we've broken in those communities.
Anyone else got a question or a comment or a provocation to make to Ginie?
I love provocations. Provoke ahead.
You won't get them from me. I thought you were fantastic, and I love listening to you. Could listen to you for hours. I was a bit more interested in the, you were talking about an example of how you have to modify your language when you're talking to, certain girls in the described ghetto. And I'd like to understand that a bit more, because whilst I love listening, I don't understand every word.
Yeah, that's, of course, doing interventions in a university is different to doing interventions in other contexts. Being able to code switch, as we call it, between different types of language is very important. Unfortunately, when you work in academic spaces, if you don't use these complicated words, you don't get anywhere. But, like for instance, we took the girls from Zambia, from the slum, away for the weekend in a little lodge. And my fellow traveler was a neuroscientist. And she really wanted to give the girls a class on women's health. So she produced little slides. It was amazing. We were sitting there was no power. She had like the backup portable projector and with 2 giant Anchor batteries. So we were we set up a little classroom in the dark in this lodge with insects flying in everywhere. And what she did is we have funded through a scholarship one of our brightest students from Zimbabwe to study medicine in Zambia. So we invited her to come over, and then my friend gave a little bit of an explanation to the girls who spoke some English about, here's your brain, here's a picture, this is your brain, this is what sugar does to your, it's a very simple with pictures. Paulo Freire talks about it a lot, about using pictures as a way to communicate. And then she said, now, if you have any questions, ask her, the medical student. Our student who's now 20, we've known her since she was 14, so she's now 23. And it was wonderful. These girls from the slum suddenly opened up and were asking questions like, what's diabetes? What do I do about, they asked something about, really questions about their liver and things like that, to this Ruva, our medical student from the Eden University. To have like that intermediary, that community leader, as the contact point. Me as a white person coming in there, I mean, there's only so much I can do, but what I can do is to empower the girls there that are from that place, that do speak that language, and work also in the Build and Climate School. I work with mentors from the vocational school to act. It's the mentor that alerted me to, hey, some of my students are not okay. Some of my students feel excluded. Oh, okay, let me see what we can do. So always, I do not have the arrogance to think that I can just waltz into a working class community, even though my family, my grandmother was a cotton mill weaver who left school at 13 and working in a factory in northern France. But, that was 2 generations ago. So I understand a little bit the context, but not enough that I can do without including the community leaders as the contact point in everything that I do. And that's also how we build communities. there are people there who've done this work forever. What they need is resources. People like Nayombe. They need resources, they need support, and they also need, and this is something I also object to on the left, they need critical partners, sparring partners, literal and metaphorical, who can tell them, I don't think that's a good idea. So it is not, I do see the opposite effect. So it used to be in the development work that we white people used to go and tell people what to do, and that was like catastrophically ineffective and insulting. And we've gone a bit too much the other way. We're like, oh, you know, just give them all the money and let them do everything. And I'm like, that is not always a good idea. It's about dialogue. We have to really talk together and be like, in my experience, this is probably not a good idea. Let's discuss this and come to an agreement together. So it's not about always deferring. And, you know, if I have a bunch of 14-year-old girls there and they're saying like, yeah, I want to go and study this, and that. I want to go study in Russia, said this girl who's now in Eden University. I said, Ruva, I am not sending you to Russia. I don't care what you say, I'm not sending you to Russia. And of course, this was before the invasion. I'm so grateful we didn't send her to Russia. Imagine what that would have been like. But also, you know, when Tinashe said, I want to go and study in Estonia, I said, I think you can do that. I will facilitate that and put my own, I think it's super important to put your money where your mouth is. What frustrates me the most is people say, you're doing such great work. Oh, you're doing fantastic stuff. You know, I'm like, yeah, and I feel very alone. It doesn't take that much to put a girl through school. It's like 35 pounds a month to put a girl through school in Zimbabwe all the way to the end of high school. And then for me to put, so a girl from our program who was our star student, who became homeless and who I vowed to support as my own daughter, I put her through, all the results are her own, but I said I will solve the financial problem for you. And I ended up paying for her master's degree in Estonia, which she now has graduated from. She's now working in the tech industry in Tallinn. A girl from the slums in Zimbabwe, who when I met her was homeless selling fish on the market, is now working in the tech industry in Tallinn. And what that cost me, 20,000 euros over 5 years, which is a lot of money, but then again, I could afford it on an assistant professor salary. So if I can do that, my frustration is we could all together put 2,000 girls through university and we don't. And that's, yeah, I'm a little tired, and this is my personal frustration. I don't know how you deal with this. I'm a little tired of people going, oh, you do such great things, you're so inspiring. And I'm like, well, then come and join me.
Well, yes, please.
Yeah, maybe one more for me. So, Ginie, I have a bit of a problem. So I spend a lot of time with private equity, financial, kind of balance sheet focused, corporate, global enterprise as like a catch-all. And on the one hand, I've observed that they don't see a collapse, right? Like, there's been this fairly blasé drift away from a net zero 1.5 focused set of market fundamentals to do a lot of commercial due diligence work. You know, the value of an asset is generally going to be predicated on policy, market, and technology trends that you can put into these convenient boxes. So one pathway has now passed, receded as an almost anachronistic feature of you know, kind of pre-COVID thinking about the way the Paris Agreement may play out. But they're certainly like 2 degrees, 2.5, it's all fine. So they assume a degree of resilience in their business models, which perhaps takes a great deal for granted in terms of the communities within which these business models take place. But they don't see it, right? And so like, I try to impart a degree of urgency, or at least, let's say, flexibility in some of the thinking that should go into the way in which different ideas of value are constructed. But I'm increasingly challenged. So my question to you is, perhaps I take your point about like if you don't have the working class, you don't have anything, right? So in your experiences of going to the South Side, what are those communities telling you about their perception of the collapse of biodiversity, environmental services, natural capital, you know, the environment within which they're thinking about their futures? And is there something in that that I can take back to the corporates? Because what I've tried, science of climate change, it's done. You know, ethics of climate change, not altogether interested. But the communities within which their consumers exist, they have to care about their consumers.
Yeah, so I'm very inspired. I'm French, by the way, and I'm very inspired by and I feel myself affiliated with the collapsology movement in France. And particularly, if there's one name I want you to take home, it's Jean-Marc Jancovici. He's written a book that has now been translated into English. It's a comic strip. It's called The World Without End. It was the most sold book in France in 2023. And he doesn't talk about climate change. He talks a bit about climate change, but it's not his starting point. And I think that's a very wise decision to, instead of focusing on climate change, and this is also the kind of anchor point of Pedagogies of Collapse, I focus on energy. And I talk about surplus energy and fossil fuels. And I talk about what happens when we no longer have the surplus energy because we've depleted, I talk about things they will understand, like EROI, energy return on investment. I'm like, do you know what the EROI was in 1900? 1 to 100. Do you know what it is now? At best, 1 to 5. We're going down to 1 to 2. Do the maths about where this leads growth in the future, about resource depletion. So that's when I talk to executives. I don't talk to them about climate change because they're so ideologically wedded to this idea that we can adapt our way out of 3 degrees, which, by the way, we can't. At 3 degrees, as Jancovici says, it's war everywhere all the time. And to focus really on energy, physics, just like resources, access to resources, cascade. I developed a board game called Collapse, which is open access. I can post a link. It's going up online in 2 days or something, so then I'll post a link on LinkedIn where you can access it. And I play it with all kinds of people, students, corporates, government people, where you see cascade effects on energy, transport, food. So I really focus on like hardcore infrastructure, energy. And I think I'm the first person to do a political economy of education based on fossil fuels, explaining that modern universities and education are completely dependent on high energy surplus to survive. And if you move that discussion away from climate change and move it to energy resilience and EROI and energy surplus, we have a different conversation. Now with working class people, it's slightly different because they feel completely disempowered. And that's the main thing I get so before I started the climate school, I did interviews with all of the students, and the main feeling was, yeah, we're screwed and there's nothing I can do. So they have quite an awareness that the world is not going too well. They're not fully aware of the extent to which it's bad, but they are aware that not all is well in the world, and they can see it at the end of the month in like how much groceries cost, in how they got locked up for 2 years. So, they can see it. The conversation I have to have there is slightly different. It's about, well, this is why. So always start with experience. This is why your grocery basket costs more. This is why you were locked up for 2 years. This is why you can't get a job. So and this is very frère, this is very critical pedagogy. Start with the direct experience. With corporates, the reason, of course, they know. They're lying to you if they say they don't know. But we have to start with why this behavior manifests in the first place. And this is my psychologist coming out. It's a trauma reflex. A lot of people end up in those kind of high-powered positions are men, usually, with some kind of trauma that they carry forward into. We do see a disproportionate amount of sociopaths in high-powered banking and corporate environments. And a lot of that is because that is what it takes to succeed in that system. Sociopathic behavior is rewarded by that system. And so you have to start with the trauma. And you have to say you really have to break it down with empathy being the best tool to say, what is it that you are afraid of in admitting that this is a possibility? And you see this toxic culture of what success means. We do have quite some success with psychedelics, by the way, in breaking some of these patterns of thought. It has to be very well accompanied, though, because psychedelics can also reinforce pathological narcissism. So, with caution, but I want to run an experiment where I put a load of bankers on psychedelics, on shrooms, and then try and convince them to care about the planet.
I can volunteer my banker. David.
Thanks, Ginie. Very thought-provoking. You seem quite convinced in the ways of doing and understanding, from your perspective. I'm wondering at which moments are you still questioning yourself and sort of exploring what are some of these keys, some of the key elements that you're still sort of not sure about your own understanding of.
Yeah, I mean, there's still, I doubt myself very frequently. I do not know yet how we win the working classes back. We have lost them so far, like they are so far down that, so what I say to the left is we have got to do better than Slavoj Žižek as an answer to Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate. What that looks like, I'm not entirely sure. I hope I can contribute to that. But surely, guys, we cannot leave the sexy, the cool, the like take care of your body and have a good self-image to the bros that are selling meat smoothies and breast milk. That's a thing, by the way. Breast milk to bulk up. Like, no, we can't. But how exactly we get away from that, I'm still trying to work out. Also, with my own family. Most of my family that is still quite working class votes for Marine Le Pen. How do I talk to them without sounding... I'm an English speaker. They all speak French. I mean, I also speak French, but I am known as the English... My brother and I are known as like the... my brother lives in Paris, so he's the Parisian, whereas we're from northern France, and like, Parisian people are so snob, and so it's... Those are very existential questions for me. And also, by the way, there's a lot of days where I wake up and I'm like, do I still have the energy to fight for this? So I have a whole chapter in the end of Pedagogies of Collapse about personal resilience and keeping up the energy, but there's some days where I can't do it. Especially, after Trump got elected, again, with a popular vote majority this time, with the Senate in his pocket. It's like, when I got back from Zambia, and I saw the situation there, I was like, what am I doing? And that is sometimes, I quote Stephen in the book because Stephen said something that really keeps me going, even sometimes I don't know how to enact that. I remember we were having lunch in London one day, and I said to you, yeah, sometimes I feel like, we're on a sinking ship and we're all gonna go down. And you said to me, well, if we're gonna go down, let us go down with flags flying. And that ended up in the book. Because, let's make a last stand if that's what it takes. I don't know if we can still win this. And that's what I tell people on the left, is like, I don't know if we can still win this. I'm not sure. But we have got to have a better story than we're gonna suffer an awful lot and it's gonna be terrible and we're awful people because we caused this, and even if we do all of this, we might still all die. Because who wants to vote for that? So I want to say, fuck it, let's do sex, drugs, rock and roll along the way, have some fun, and maybe we survive. That would be cool, but at least let's have some fun along the way.
Well, to a certain extent, one of your great heroines, Simone de Beauvoir, did exactly that.
Exactly.
I mean, when I had a semester retreat in Paris, I deliberately rented the apartment next door to her last apartment because I wanted to be, as though in some way, touched by the aura of greatness. But it really was sex, drugs, rock and roll, and let us say, not being able to keep track of partners and things like that.
No, I try to keep track of my partners.
But let's take it to Paris. I mean, what does someone, a very great person, a fundamentally pioneering person, and a brave person like Simone de Beauvoir mean to you? What kind of role model do you aspire to be like?
Yeah, so for me, growing up in a very conservative, Catholic, still partly working class, partly middle class family, I didn't have female role models growing up. The women in my family were very much put down by a very patriarchal form of, my grandfather was a terror, and my uncles and my father were also, very domineering men. And the women in my family were expected to put up and shut up and cook. My mother didn't work. So I didn't have something to aspire to close to me. I found refuges in the tales of incredible women. My first heroine was Alexandre David Neal, the French explorer who walked to Lhasa in 1930. And in the stories of these women, finding that it was okay to be different. Because in my family, it was not okay to be different. I, suffered quite thoroughly as a teenager. I was already very queer in all senses of the word. Not fitting in. I also was pulled from a rural French countryside school and put into a Montessori school, Dalton School in the Netherlands, where it saved my life, it made me who I am, and then pulled back into a French public school at the age of 13. You can imagine how well that went. I was unruly. I would get kicked out of class for insolence. So I discovered Simone de Beauvoir a little later, but Maria Montessori, Hannah Arendt, Simone de Beauvoir, these women who refused, who looked at the world as it was and said, I'm not going to do that. That to me, Simone de Beauvoir, who was basically polyamorous and queer in the 1940s, and committed activist for her entire life, and didn't seem to fear what the consequences of that decision would be, I'm just sad we never got to share the planet because she died a month before I was born. I would not be who I am if Simone de Beauvoir hadn't paved the way for that possibility. And her existentialism is far superior to the existentialism of Sartre or of Heidegger. The Ethics of Ambiguity is the masterpiece of 20th century philosophy. And it's also actually readable, as opposed to Heidegger and Sartre. If you are not into reading nonfiction, then The Mandarins is a beautiful existential political book that, guess what the plot is? The left tearing itself apart from the inside because the socialists and communists can't agree on what to do, and then the right wins. Sounds familiar? But it's also a love story that contends with her deep existential crisis. When I was reading it, I was like, get out of my head. This is how I'm thinking. Stop it. So reading de Beauvoir is like reading my own thoughts sometimes.
Okay. In the foreword I wrote to Ginie's book, I did say that she is the true daughter of Beauvoir, and that was meant as the highest compliment that I could give.
That's how I took it.
To her. So I think that, are there any more questions? It might be a time to devolve to informal discussion. We can all mingle and chat, and you can raise questions that you want to raise individually to Ginie. We've got this room for another little while, but if people want to break into a more informal setting now, perhaps we could do that. I think, however, before we do that, we should do one thing that's traditional, even though she's not a very traditional person, and that is to thank her. Before we do break into informal discussion, can I ask one last question, which perhaps begs a contradiction? You've been a rebel all your life. You've always felt like an outsider. And now recognitions are coming in for you. If I've got it right, not only are you the latest associate member, but the youngest member of the Club of Rome. That doesn't come easy. It's a real honor. It's a conferring of an honor upon you. How do you square being the rebel with being a recognized and respected thinker?
Yeah, I was just talking about that with Alex. I was saying it's not easy. When the book came out, people wrote some quite crazy things about it online. All good, but like intense. It's a book that has seemingly touched people on a very existential, personal. People say they feel electrified by the book. They say that it's the best thing they've read since Ministry for the Future in terms of how it's impact. And for me, when I wrote the book, I just wrote down what I had in my heart and just like almost vomited the words on the page. Like it had to come out. It's like a furball stuck in my throat. I just was like, this is me, this is my life, this is my book, this is my existentialism. If it touches people, great. If not, and now suddenly it's like, oh, can you come give a lecture here and do a podcast there? And then that's, for me, ultimately, I promise myself that I will always remain authentic, that I will continue to defy and you know. So I had a discussion with my publisher about whether I should move to the trades division or stay in the academic, and he said to me, stay in the academic so you can stay free. And I said, I'll take that, because I don't want some editor telling me something to be more commercial or to, you know, I promise this, that I will remain inescapably myself with all my quirks and flaws and unruliness and the difficulty of working with me. And it's also why I'm not looking for an academic career, because you have to conform to make it to professor. So I refuse to conform. And that's okay with me. It's an act. Rebellion takes commitment. I'm committed.
Rebellion takes commitment. On that note, ladies and gentlemen, let's circulate and have some informal discussion. You might want to stretch your legs now anyway after a good hour. And please,